Hi, and welcome to the Contemporary Old West channel. I write contemporary Western novels, some set in modern times, others in the Old West. Part of this channel is about bringing you those stories in serialized format. I'll release a new chapter each week, and you can follow along with the story. If you find you enjoy my writing, I invite you to check out my author's page on Amazon. My name is B.F. Biles, and I'll have a link in the description below. If you'd like to own a signed copy of one of my books, those are available from my Patreon page, also with the link below. Along with my writing, every week I'll include other content. Each episode will contain what I'm calling a plate of history beans, a segment that will expand upon something found in the chapter. I live in the Texas Panhandle, the part of the world where many historical clashes between the expanding American experience and native tribes took place. I hope to show you some of those places that commemorate the magnificent native cultures and the founding families who made our nation what it is today. If you're interested in the Old West, I would be grateful if you hit the subscribe button and bell icon. Though I'm not a historian, the Old West has long been a passion of mine. In the weeks and months ahead, I hope to take you not only into the pages of my books, but also into some of the real stories and perhaps some of the romanticized notions of the Old West. Thanks for your support. Without further ado, this is the Contemporary Old West with B.F. Biles. Hunting Charm by B.F. Biles. Copyright 2023, Brent F. Biles. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced or used in any manner without written permission of the copyright owner, except for the use of quotations or excerpts in a book review. For Francis Ann. Every angel is terrifying. Rainer Maria Rilke. Are you a lucky little lady in the city of light, or just another lost angel? City of Night. Jim Morrison. Some of the most beautiful things worth having in your life come wrapped in a crown of thorns. Shannon L. Adler. Chapter 1. Hunting Charm, the Buffalo Soldier and His Bride. Following 3 years of service as a Union Army muleteer, Cecil Johnson enlisted for an additional 2 years, which he served with the 9th Cavalry at Fort Union in New Mexico. If one bothered to examine Johnson's service record, he would find that Cecil followed orders and left with the usual honors afforded enlisted men. Though he never fought in any famous battles, Cecil displayed courage, discipline, fortitude, and the common sense to never openly disagree with his white commanders. He never, while on duty or in anger, harmed anyone. On one occasion, during his time with the 9th Cavalry, while on patrol in the Indian Territories, Johnson met a former slave woman, Cynthia McQueen, who agreed to become his wife. It isn't widely known, but before the Civil War, some native folks owned slaves. In general, the 5 civilized tribes were kinder to their chattel than their white counterparts, though without doubt exceptions existed. It cannot be said that Cynthia McQueen lived in great comfort during her years of enslavement. What condition of enslavement can be called comfortable? But Creek Chief Jake McQueen, Cynthia's former owner, was a decent man. Indeed, Cynthia thought highly enough of Jake that following emancipation, she took her former owner's name. It didn't hurt that Chief McQueen granted Cynthia a plot of farmland. Things were not easy. Despite the help of an elderly gentleman from Mississippi named Mr. Sugars and occasional gifts of food from Jake, Cynthia barely managed to survive. If she stopped long enough to think of it, she reckoned that one day she would die of exhaustion, starvation, boredom, or all three. So when a 9th Cavalry Patrol, 12 Buffalo soldiers with a white lieutenant in charge, rode into Chief McQueen's settlement, Cynthia saw an opportunity to find a husband. She didn't hesitate. At the time, the Creek Nation occupied the central part of what would later become Oklahoma. Jake, a shrewd businessman, had exploited the property ownership structures set up by the Dawes Act and had, by hook or crook, accumulated a decent-sized tract of land, nearly 10 sections. Whether the land was his would later come under dispute thanks to the clever, some might say sinister, machinations of white men. Nevertheless, for a time, Jake was a man of decent means. Along with Cynthia, Jake's community spread over a 10-mile radius and consisted of 7 homes, 4 houses for relatives, and 3 others occupied by former slaves. The kindly Mr. Sugars bunked in Cynthia's barn, and a troubled former slave everyone called Cactus Branch lived less than a mile away from Cynthia in a place of his own. As a child, Henry Walker survived a torturous beating from a band of slave hunters. The experience left the boy with a malformed right shoulder and a claw-like lower right arm. The bodily defects didn't bother Cynthia. In fact, based on his physical features alone, Cactus Branch might have been called handsome. The Creek women who spied upon his bathing in a stream claimed Henry was possessed by a dark and sinister Atman and giggled about his size. Like his father, he stood well over 6 feet tall, and despite his handicap, most agreed Henry possessed the strength of 4 men. The beating and the death of Henry's father left psychological wounds, the kind that never fully heal. His demeanor made everyone, including Cynthia, uneasy. Henry Cactus Branch Walker lived beneath a cloud of woe, his brow perpetually knitted in despair, his eyes dark and downcast. The native tribesmen showed no interest in having Cynthia for a wife, so until the appearance of the cavalry patrol that day, no prospects for a husband other than Cactus Branch and the elderly Mr. Sugars existed. Mr. Sugars, who could still recall times 30 years before the war when slaves arrived from the Caribbean speaking in odd dialects, had lived a rich life. Despite enslavement, he had married twice, fathered and raised 6 children, and claimed to have 20 or more grandchildren. When Cynthia suggested they might form a household together, the elderly gentleman laughed and told a story he claimed came from the old country. In the story, an elderly bull elephant finds himself alone on the savannah with a young and beautiful cow. Because of the great spaces in the vast African wilderness, the cow took the old bull into her embraces. Soon a female calf sprang from the young cow's womb, but the old bull had little energy or affection for his infant daughter. One day, as the old bull grew increasingly feeble, a young bull appeared, but the cow, now with the old bull's calf, felt obliged to remain faithful to her husband. The story seemed ridiculously thin in its conception. Cynthia realized that Mr. Sugars had concocted the tale to tell her, in the gentlest way, that she should remain patient. She thanked him, but explained that life had grown impossibly hard. What if her young bull never appeared? Mr. Sugars simply nodded. He felt Cynthia had more strength than she knew. He also assured her that he would remain living in her barn, there to help in any way he could. Together, he said, the days would pass, and eventually God, or some kindness that is nature, would provide a solution. Since Mr. Sugars widely refused her, the only possible husband remaining before Cecil and his cavalry patrol appeared was Cactus Branch. Unfortunately, Henry Walker, with his humped shoulder and dark, expressionless gaze, remained heedless of her advances. If she attempted to exchange pleasantries, Cactus Branch averted his eyes and walked away without speaking. If she invited him to dinner, he arrived, washed but silent, chewing at his morose cud, then abruptly leaving with a mumbled, "Thank you." So when the 9th Cavalry Patrol with 12 young men of color and a single white lieutenant appeared outside her farm on the afternoon of September 12th, Cynthia pushed aside her lack of confidence and asked who was in charge. It so happened that the white officer in command had already issued orders regarding communications with native tribesmen and former slaves. "I don't speak with them folks, 'cause I ain't of their kind. However, common courtesy and protocol requires they be addressed. When greeting redskins and other colored folks, Sergeant Johnson will act as our ambassador. The rest of you will get the tents up and supper on the fire." So it was that Cynthia McQueen first came to speak with the man who would later become her husband. It's unclear why the 9th Cavalry Patrol, under the command of Lieutenant Allen Fox, traveled so far into Indian Territory that fall. The decision to ride south from the Santa Fe Trail seemed like a whim, as if Lieutenant Fox had grown bored with the featureless flatlands between Fort Union in New Mexico and Kansas City. The enlisted men had grumbled privately, disappointed by Fox's decision. They had been looking forward to a few nights in Kansas City, a place with a thriving black community. Still, orders were orders, and to question a white officer might be construed as insubordination. So, Cecil Johnson met Cynthia. Their first discourse consisted of an exchange of mailing information and little else. The troops left the small settlement the following morning with only a brief goodbye. They returned north until they came again to the Santa Fe Trail. From there they followed the well-established track back to their original point of departure, Fort Union in New Mexico. Over the next few months, the couple exchanged several letters, rendering what might have been an uncertain agreement concrete. The following January, Cecil Johnson left New Mexico, his term of enlistment complete. In his pocket he carried a little over $20 in gold, money carefully saved from his military pay. He also owned 3 healthy female horses and a single male donkey, all purchased through a local program instituted by the Fort Union commander, designed to encourage mule breeding. Johnson had planned carefully, and on that frosty January morning when he set out for Cynthia's homestead, he felt confident that he could accomplish his modest goal to breed, raise, and sell mules to the U.S. Cavalry. Their marriage vows were solemnized by Chief Jake McQueen and legalized later via correspondence with a traveling judge from Arkansas for a fee of 50 cents. Cecil settled into Cynthia's modest dugout the day he arrived. 2 days later, he began construction of a newer house a quarter mile to the south near a towering hackberry tree alongside a swampish stream thick with cattails and switchgrass. 6 years later, the plan to breed mules succeeded thanks in part to Jake McQueen. The Creek chieftain had been secretly thrilled when Cecil arrived. He knew that the woman he called daughter had been struggling. 6 years later, after his humble start with 3 mares and a donkey, Cecil fulfilled a government contract for 20 mules. At the stockyards in Abilene, Kansas, he received a check for $325, a decent price. Later that day, Cecil signed a contract with a man named Theo Tarwater for 10 mules per annum, more if he had them, price to be determined by fair market value each year. Unfortunately, Cecil Johnson had no idea that Theophilus Tarwater had a daughter. As he left Abilene with 2 loads laden with supplies, Cecil was also unaware that Theo's daughter, Doreen, lay hidden beneath the tarpaulin of his second wagon, a rig driven by the cataract blind and nearly deaf Mr. Sugars. Thanks for listening to Chapter 1 of Hunting Charm. Now it's time for a history plate of beans. If you recall from Chapter 1, central character Cecil Johnson served with the 9th Cavalry out of Fort Union in New Mexico. First, let me say that my book is fiction, so some of the details present in the story aren't 100% accurate. I apologize for that. The U.S. 9th Cavalry, for a time, was posted at Fort Union in New Mexico, but the posting didn't begin until 1876, a few years after the events in my story. So I hope you'll forgive my artistic license, because the story of Buffalo Soldiers is one worth telling. Following the Civil War, Congress created 6 all-black military units. The number was quickly reduced to just 4 units, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Cecil Johnson, one of the central characters in Hunting Charm, ostensibly served with the 9th Cavalry. These men were highly respected by the native people of the Great Plains, who gave them their moniker, Buffalo Soldiers. The name stuck. The 10th Cavalry even adopted the buffalo as their regimental crest. While Hunting Charm and Cecil are fictional, the service provided by the Buffalo Soldiers were important to the development of life in the Old West following the Great War. These brave men served in the construction of roads, railroads, bridges, and assured the safe passage of mail in some of the last strongholds of the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne Plains Indians of New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Texas. It was a dangerous job, and they did it well. The men themselves were not always given the respect they deserved. Not surprisingly, there were cases of extreme prejudice against their ranks. Many officers, George Armstrong Custer, for example, refused to command black regiments. Buffalo Soldiers were only allowed to serve west of the Mississippi because Southerners didn't want armed blacks in their communities. Over the years, 18 Buffalo Soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor, and eventually, thanks to their service, racial barriers within our armed services were some of the first in our society to fall. In 1877, a Buffalo soldier named Henry Flipper, born a slave, became the first black man to graduate from the West Point Academy. Unfortunately, Flipper faced such resentment, he was subjected to a smear campaign and dismissed from the Army in 1882. In 1999, he was posthumously pardoned by President Bill Clinton. During the early part of the 20th century, the 9th Cavalry were so renowned for their horsemanship, they served at West Point, training cadets in riding skills and tactics from 1907 until 1947. When Teddy Roosevelt created many of the national parks, Buffalo Soldiers created trails and roads in Yosemite and Sequoia National Park, including a trail to the top of Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the United States. The 10th Cavalry played a crucial role in securing the Mexican border during the Mexican Revolution and helped force the surrender of Mexican militia in the Battle of Ambos Nogales. Woodrow Wilson continued to segregate our armed forces during World War I, and Buffalo Soldiers were excluded from the American Expeditionary Forces. In World War II, the 9th and 10th Cavalry regiments were disbanded and troops moved into service roles. However, the 92nd Infantry, the Buffalo Division, saw combat during the invasion of Italy, and the 25th Infantry fought in the Pacific Theater. Finally, in 1951, the last segregated regiments were disbanded and black soldiers were fully integrated into our armed forces. It's impossible for me to tell you everything about the near century of service the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry gave to our nation. If you want to know more about Buffalo Soldiers and the African American military experience, and you happen to be in Washington, D.C., you might stop into the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. If you're in Houston, let me recommend the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum. Or if you're in Tacoma, Washington, check out the Buffalo Soldiers Museum. I'll have links to all three of those websites in the description below. Thanks again for joining me for Chapter 1 of my novel, Hunting Charm. I'll have a new chapter each week and another plate of history beans. Once more, if you enjoy Western culture and history, I would be grateful if you hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. So until next time, this has been Contemporary Old West with B.F. Miles.